So why don't we begin? I'm Scott Sagan, co-director here at the Center for International Security and Cooperation and professor of political science. I want to welcome you to this research seminar featuring Frank Gavin speaking on Thinking Historically, a Guide to Statecraft and Strategy. Frank is the Giovanni Angeli Distinguished Professor and Director of the Henry A. Kissinger Center on Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies in Washington. Prior to that, he was the Frank Stanton Chair in Nuclear Security Policy Studies at MIT. And before that, he was the Tom Slick Professor of International Affairs and Director of the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas. Frank is well known, I think, to most of you in this audience, which is why we've got such a great audience today, because he combines fantastic historical work with strong social science sensibilities. For those of you who have not read the recent piece in the Texas National Security Review, where he imitates the typical political science intro and a typical history intro, you also should note that he can be a good historian and a satirist on top of all the great work that he does. It's a really very, very funny piece. This is a very serious book that he's going to be talking about today. We'll follow the normal CSAC procedures. Frank will speak. I'll ask the fellows here at CSAC to ask the first few questions. We'll open it up to people in the audience. We'll follow a one finger, two finger rule. If you want to get on the queue, raise your hand, one finger. If you want to jump the queue to do a follow-up, please raise your hand and I'll try to catch your attention. And for those of you online, please put your question into the Q&A and I'll try to go back and forth between people in the room and people online. So without further ado, please welcome Frank Gavin.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. It's just wonderful to be here. And I have to say, seeing this building, I recall when I was a young professor at University of Texas, and the University of Texas didn't have much in the way of international security, foreign policy offerings. The LBJ school had none, and we were looking to build stuff. I came here as a very young professor to visit with Scott to get some guidance and advice, and he was incredibly warm and generous, and much of what we ended up building at University of Texas had a lot to do with Scott's incredible mentorship, friendship, and guidance. So I am incredibly grateful for his wonderful friendship and guidance over the years. I'm also thrilled to see Phil Zellico, who's a great inspiration of this book. In fact, I told Phil, there's two versions of this talk, one if Phil was here, one if Phil wasn't here. So now I'm going to have to rapidly switch. And that's basically because he's had to listen or answer countless emails over the years about this book. And he's been incredibly generous and is really one of the great mentors and sort of voices behind this book. So I'm at a little bit of an odd point in it that the book is done. I just sent off the proofs. It's coming out in July, so the book will be out. And unfortunately, when you tell me everything that's wrong with it, there's nothing that can be done about it. But I also can't sell the book. So this is, again, historians are noted for being incredibly impractical and unwise and have no common sense. So giving a book talk on a book that's completed but not out or ready for sale is about par for the course for a historian. So thank you for putting up with that. And this is really the first time I've talked about it. So we'll see how this goes. I kind of debated what to do. And there's an aspect of this that's slightly uncomfortably autobiographical or memoir-like. The book is not written like a memoir, but what inspired it was. I'm a trained historian. I believe deeply, passionately in the historical mission, yet my career has been, I've never been in a history department. Anyone here who's in a history department? One person, two people, David. Yeah, yes. And my employers have been schools of public affairs, schools of international relations. I was in a political science department. I've had affiliations with business schools, with law schools. but I've never actually been in a history department. And so there's a touch, and we can talk about that a little bit in Q&A. Perhaps it's just because I'm a terrible historian, so a lot of this was motivated by my effort to try to figure out what is the value proposition for history for all of these audiences, whether it's political scientists, social scientists, economists, policymakers, decision makers, who have generously employed me and taken an interest in my work. And I first started thinking about this a very long time ago. I was a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania, had wonderful mentors in Mark Trachtenberg, I'm sure many of you know, and Wally McDougall. And I was on the job market, and I was very fortunate to get a job at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Policy. I got the job sort of, it was kind of a random occurrence because what had happened is in 1999, the Presidential Library had decided to release the tapes of President Johnson. The wonderful director at the time, Harry Middleton, a very charismatic guy, knew he was LBJ's speechwriter, and they had released these tapes, caused an enormous amount of public acclaim, and the school and the library both report to a foundation, and the people at the foundation went to the leaders of the school and said, "What are you doing about this?" Of course, it was a school filled with economists, sociologists, urban policy people, political scientists. They had no idea, and they panicked, and they advertised for a presidential historian. I am not a presidential historian, but I can play one in the movies. Ended up getting the job, showed up at the LBJ School of Public Affairs in the fall of 2000, and then tried to figure out, what should I teach? How should I teach? What could I offer to, it was a graduate school of public affairs where most of the students were going on to positions in policy and public affairs and public administration. So they had a course called policy development. And I thought, well, I could teach that. And I structured the course in such a way that there were two major case studies: American policy towards Germany, which I considered a success, and American policy in Southeast Asia. American policy on Germany very much heavily relied on Phil's excellent book with Condi Rice and some case studies. But the Vietnam book relied very heavily on Fred Logevall's Choosing War. And given that I was next door to the LBJ Presidential Library, I would have the students do a decision-making exercise over what Fred had called the long 1964. And I would have the students play Dean Rusk, George Ball, various other characters, Bundy, and then we would have a simulation. And they would use these documents, they learned how to do primary research, and they would see how the policy would develop. And it was a wonderful exercise. There was no doubt that this set of policy choices were a case study, at least in my mind, of policy gone wrong. And then I was looking over my notes a few years later, and in the spring semester of 2001, when I taught this, I ended the class by saying, well, at least, because this was a course about Vietnam, about a US intervention in a small, faraway country to try to convert and transform its society. I said, well, at least we'll never have to worry about this ever again. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I was haunted by the idea that if policymakers had had the opportunity to engage deeply and seriously in sort of historical reflections and examination, it doesn't guarantee that they would always make the right choices. But it seemed to me that at least the debate in 2002 and 2003 might have been richer, might have been more productive if in general this sort of idea of engaging with history had taken place. And so I started thinking about this that long ago. And again, this took entirely too long to write. I say in the introduction, it both took too long to write and it feels like it's not done, because history, I came to the conclusion, is about a conversation, and the book is an effort to start the conversation. So then the question would be, all right, if you want to use history for policy, why wasn't this done more regularly? Why wasn't this already done more regularly? One of the things I discovered, as through good fortune, I started in certain projects to engage with people in the policy world, projects that Phil has been involved with me, the International Policy Scholars Consortium and Network, something that Scott was involved in with me, the Nuclear Studies Research Initiative, and then just being in Washington on occasion, you realize that policymakers found history to be a very valuable epistemology as they kind of struggled with decision making. But there was very little in sort of the historical field to give you a sense of what was the best way of going about doing this. Now, there is a great book by Dick Neustadt and Ernie May, Thinking in Time. It's quite old. It's got some good parts, but I think if you were to give me a truth serum, I'd say the best, it's more of a textbook for how to navigate the bureaucratic politics of Washington, D.C., than sort of a deep reflection on using history to navigate critical, difficult decisions facing on radical uncertainty about the future. So my book builds upon it, but I think hopefully goes beyond it. But then there was this question, why wasn't more already done? And the book talks about it, but I just want to sort of highlight three issues. The first is that history is kind of unique in the way it's deployed because it is used. Everyone uses. Our brains are structured to think about the past and to think historically. We just do it really poorly. And in fact, a lot of the book spends some time thinking about how to identify and correct for the misuses of history. Now, there's something inherent to the historical undertaking that makes this so, and that is because since everyone thinks they can do it, no one necessarily thinks it's a particularly difficult skill to obtain. I'm sure for the historian friends in the audience, you've gone to a holiday party or visited your family and someone asks you something about history or the past, and you answer and they interrupt you and they say, well, I think this about the past, right? No one goes and says, well, I've had these incredible insights about brain surgery and how it should be done, or how to design an aircraft so it doesn't fall out of the sky, right? But people would never do that, but they feel like they can do that with history. And in the book, I contend that developing a historical sensibility and learning how to think historically is as difficult, if not more difficult, a skill than neurosurgery or aircraft design. But everyone thinks they do it. So there's a presumption that there's no particular skill involved. And in fact, this leads to the second issue, which there's no way to measure success. If you're a bad brain surgeon, it becomes fairly clear and you are run out of the profession. If you're a bad airplane designer, it catches up with you. Undertaking problematic or less than effective history is hard to measure except for by the judgments of the discipline itself. And I'm not going to talk a lot about the state of the history discipline. I don't want this to be that talk, but I have views. And let's just say that the discipline being the one responsible for deciding what is good and what is bad is not necessarily the best way to go about it. Which leads to a second issue, and that is history has always had an identity crisis. Scott very kindly mentioned my social science temperament. History does not know whether it is a social science or a humanities. And it has different intellectual roots in both. If you look at sort of my university, Johns Hopkins University, where the kind of German model of social science really took off in the United States in the 1870s with economics and political science and anthropology, history was firmly in the social sciences. But there are many practitioners of history who believe it does not belong there. Jacques Barzun who's perhaps was our greatest cultural historian, just found the idea that history was similar in the way it was something like statistics was just absolutely crazy. And when I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, they've changed this since, but you could major, the University of Chicago had 4 different schools: physical sciences, biological sciences, social sciences, humanities. History was the only major that you could take in either the social sciences or the humanities. The only difference was if you took it in the social sciences, you took 1 language in statistics. And if you took it in humanities, you took 2 languages. There's an identity question. And I talk about this in the book about how there's a number of issues and questions that social sciences take for granted, such as questions about objectivity or questions about moral judgment and fact value distinctions that social sciences take as given and historians wrestle with and never fully resolve, which generates a sort of identity question. History can't even really answer the question, what part of the past is worth exploring? Now, we know the past is infinite. You need some sort of standards or measures or ideas about what part of the past should be studied and what shouldn't. This is the basic social science question of what matters. History does not have that, nor does it encourage you to have it. Even Michael Howard, who is someone sympathetic to the kind of diplomatic and military history that I pursue, in the lessons of history talks about how no part of the past is more important than any other. And while there's a certain charm to that, from a common sense perspective, people look at this and say, well, that just makes no sense. The third challenge, and this gets particularly to the issue of why history is not more engaged with strategy and statecraft, is that it fares poorly versus more muscular epistemologies. You compare it, and I talk about this in the book, with economics or better international relations theory. Now, some of my best friends are IR theorists. Many of them are in the room. And when I think about IR theory, I think about certain qualities that they possess that are incredibly attractive. IR theories have to be falsifiable, meaning you have to go out there and be able to, if you have a hypothesis, generate and test it over and over again and see how often it's right or wrong. Knowledge should be cumulative, right? You answer one question satisfactorily and you move on to the next. Theory should be generalizable and hopefully predictive. If you have a theory that explains war and peace, it should explain the War of Jenkins' Ear as well as it explains Russia's attack on Ukraine. And the best theories are parsimonious. And this is all pursued through causal identification strategies where independent variables are identified. Deep down, historians believe none of this is true. Right? We don't believe there are such things as independent variables. In terms of just something as cumulative, like we are obsessed with the origins of the First World War, right? You would think all of my IR friends say, haven't we settled this? Can't we just read Fritz Fisher and move on? And there is something about the historical undertaking where the focus is on things like context, chance, contingency, circumstance. Our answer to everything is it's complicated. If you're thinking about statecraft and you have 15 minutes with a principal who faces enormous time pressures and sort of an economist or an IR theorist comes in and says, look, here's a declining power, here's a rising power, 83% of the time it will behave this way, and this is the policy this is the policy you should embrace and pursue. That's incredibly attractive. And the historian comes in and says, I don't know about these cases this person identified. I don't know what a rising power, how do you define power? I don't know. And all of a sudden 15 minutes is up and the policymaker just says, I don't even know what that was, right? So there's a whole bunch of other stuff in the book about why this is, but part of what I'm trying to do in the book is to deal with this question or deal with these set of issues and to come up with some set of principles and rules. And I'm not going to go through them all. I'll just give you a little bit of a sample. But the interlocking ideas in the book is that that a good historical training involves developing a historical sensibility and then learning how to think historically. And they're interlocking but distinct undertakings. A historical sensibility is a temperament. It's sort of a disposition to the world. It's the idea of epistemological modesty and prudence. It's in the famous Isaiah Berlin, Leo Tolstoy notion to not be a hedgehog, but to be a fox. To challenge assumptions, to focus on temporal and spatial perspectives, to seek objectivity while always understanding that it's elusive. All the kind of skills, and there's a whole list in there and I spend some time, but it's basically a discernment, a way of looking at the world, of taking the same problem and turning it around in many different ways. But I mentioned in that while that is a useful disposition to the world, it is not enough to actually impact statecraft and strategy. And so then I talk about developing a set of historical skills, and I go through it. I have the other talk I was going to give that I didn't give because Phil is here and he's heard me give it, but we're in a period now where everyone says we're in Cold War II, or the return of geopolitics. And the question when people look at historical analogies, they ask, is the present thing we're looking at like the thing we're studying in the past? And what I suggest in a long chapter that sort of looks at all these different questions of the Cold War is to say, we don't even know what the thing in the past we're comparing it to is. So I ask a bunch of simple questions about the Cold War. I'll just give you one example. When did it start? All right. So if there's a certain group of historians believe it begins the minute the Second World War ends, there's other who don't believe it doesn't begin until 1949. If you're Mel Leffler or David Engerman, you believe it began in 1917. And if you're Arnie Wested, who is perhaps our greatest Cold War historian, he places the beginning of it in the late 19th century. Right? And I go through a whole series of questions. When did it begin? When does it end? What are its causes? How does it compete with other international political phenomena in the post-war period? How much does policy matter in determining the outcome we care about? And I have a whole exercise where I challenge this whole notion that we even know, or that we even have a unified version of what the Cold War was. And it's a reminder that the Cold War doesn't exist in nature, just like liberalism doesn't exist in nature. I have a chapter or a section where I talk about the debate over feudalism. Right? There's this great historian of feudalism who wrote this article. It said feudalism is not a thing. It doesn't exist. And there's been a 50-year debate about this. And the most powerful way I can have to describe this is one of the aspects of the historical sensibility is to recognize that all history is contemporary history. And what I do is I ask the readers to go through this exercise. Imagine a publisher has come to you in 1992 and asked you to write a history of world politics from 1945 to 1991. You're writing it, you publish it in 1992. And you get only 300 pages, not one page more. Writing in 1992, with the end of the Cold War just behind you and the collapse of the Soviet Union, odds are about 280 pages would be on the Cold War, largely focused on Europe. Now imagine your publisher came and asked you to rewrite that book in 2002. It's still on world politics between 1945 and 1991. You still only have 300 pages. But in 2002, you've noticed a lot of things have happened in the world that have interested you. The 9/11 attacks on the United States, European integration and union. You might then say to yourself, regardless of whether I know more about the past, I'll probably reduce the amount of pages on the Cold War in Europe, perhaps to maybe 230 pages, and have something about the origins of American policy in the Middle East, maybe something on the '67 war, the civil war in Lebanon, the Iranian Revolution, the Shia Revolution, and then perhaps some history the Schuman Plan, the European coal and steel community, and things like that. You're asked to do it again in 2012, after the great financial crisis. Then perhaps you're changing how you're writing it again, and maybe, again, it's still not past the year 1991, but you reorient sort of the chronological division. And then in 2022, with the rise of China, the book looks completely different. Now imagine you're writing that book for audiences in different places. Maybe you're writing them for audiences in Beijing, for audiences in Moscow, for audiences in Johannesburg, or audiences in Rio. Or maybe the book ended, you first wrote the first edition in 1987. The point of this exercise is to demonstrate that all of those volumes will probably, even though they look at the same period of time and presumably the same question, would look very different. And they would change over time because the lens would shift. This is one of the things that I think even historians are uncomfortable with. But when you're aware of that kind of changing sort of lens, it affects how you think about these things. So anyway, I go through a whole bunch of that. I list a whole bunch of different historical skills, thinking more deeply about causality and agency, reflecting on time horizons and critical junctures, temporal and spatial historical perspective, the idea of precision. This is something I got from Phil and his excellent microhistories, how to weave together micro and macro analyses, how to avoid paralysis by analysis and the necessity of choice. So there's a whole variety of things, but the most important skill that thinking historically should develop that I talk about in the book is asking better questions. And the way I highlight this is a certain image of what a historian does. Two images: what a historical sensibility translates into effectively thinking historically. So the first image is one of a powerful magnet, drawing in relevant information that may be hidden, enmeshed in non-magnetic materials, or too far away to obtain without the magnet's power. The magnet is historical sensibility. It pulls into view people, events, and historical forces that are not often seen or obscured by other forms of analysis. It's pulling stuff in through the historian's sensibility you would otherwise not get. But that's not enough. To make the move to the act of thinking historically, another image emerges, and that's of a chemical dye dropped in a large sample that bonds to and highlights what truly matters. In other words, a historical sensibility married to thinking historically at its best pulls out the necessary and important knowledge while ruthlessly eliminating the overwhelming mass of extraneous or distracting information that makes up the past. The past is infinite, and without the powerful, well thought out filters and guidance that thinking historically provides, it will likely overwhelm the decision makers. So that all makes sense, but how do you do it? And so in the penultimate chapter, I come up with what I call a historian's checklist. Now, you all may know about the checklist phenomena. In the 1930s, the United States, preparing for war, was developing a variety of long-range aircraft. These planes were getting larger, faster, more complex, and they were crashing more. And so what developed as a result of some of these accidents was better trained pilots asking a series of questions before takeoff to make sure they avoided disaster. Were the turbos and autopilot off? Check. Was the tailwind locked in the gyro set? Check. And a uniform list was created that allowed flight crews to dramatically reduce crashes caused by pilot error, and it's now a standing operating procedure for pilots around the world. And you might know the story about how this was adopted by emergency room physician Atul Gawande. There's a variety of questions that are asked in emergency rooms about hygienic needles, about various procedures. But when you ask these questions and make sure that they're answered, it turns out you dramatically reduce human error and mortality in hospitals. So I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if you could develop a historical checklist in order to help decision makers manage complexity and minimize harm while making foreign policy? So I generated 12 historical questions that I believe were worth asking when approaching a contemporary dilemma, a challenge, or a choice. And I connected each of these questions to what I saw as an important and at times counterintuitive historical insight and practice. And again, this checklist can be used by decision makers, or it can actually be used by historians trying to make sense of things. Now, I'm aware that this is not a perfect comparison. There are profound differences from checklists in aviation and medicine and the historical one that I have in the book. The first two generate, more often than not, simple binary answers, yes or no, or specific measurements, whereas the questions on the history checklist are open-ended, interpretive, and often messy. And even though an effective checklist should contain a uniform and limited number of clear queries, there are clearly more than 12 historical questions worth asking, and one can also imagine adapting them according to the particular situation that you face, and Gawande does this as well. But I basically offered this less as the definitive list and more to force historians to think about what it was they were doing, to be more self-conscious about it, so that they could then offer those principles and ideas to statesmen and strategists as they were making decisions. Just to step back for a minute, one of the things that social science is really, really good at, and history is very, very bad at, is being explicit about the underlying assumptions about causality and agency to go into the arguments historians often make. And this list, if it does nothing else, forces you to sort of think about that. So what is the list? So it's 12, and I'll tell you what the 12 are, and there's only one I'm going to go into in some detail. The first question is, how did we get here? Vertical history. This is a lot more complicated than it sounds. I spent a lot of time looking at the First World War. It matters quite a bit if you think that the cause of the First World War was Archduke Fritz Ferdinand's driver making a left turn when he should have made a right on June 28, 1914. And if he had not made that wrong turn, you wouldn't have the First World War. Or whether you believe longer-term forces such as nationalism, social Darwinism, population increases, imperialism mattered. But there is a way of asking, how did we get here, that allows you to think about those short, medium, longer-term causes. And I have a whole thing in there where I actually give some praise to Ken Waltz and his 3 images as a way of doing this. The second is what else is happening, horizontal history. The third is what is unsaid, or unspoken assumptions. The fourth is how are things trending, time lags, and historical anamnesis. Historical anamnesis is this idea that I'm really fascinated by, which I talk a lot about in this thing that I just did that Phil knows about, which is our inability to recognize when things are actually getting better and what cost that comes at. The fifth is, how is this understood by others? Perspective. The sixth is, why does this matter? Chronological proportionality. 7 is, what are the possible unexpected outcomes, unintended consequences? 8 was this inevitable? Outcome bias. 9 was, are things changing rapidly? Punctuated equilibrium. 10 is, are we using the past correctly? Historical malpractice. 11 is, was this unprecedented? Historical myopia. And 12, what does it mean? That is historical purpose. But I just want to talk a little bit and conclude here by talking about the second, what else is happening, which is horizontal history, because it involves some of my own research and how I came to this insight, and sort of answers the question that I'm sure people like Scott and Ori and others have had, is how did this guy go from writing about international monetary relations, then to writing about nuclear strategy, then to writing about nuclear proliferation, and why I keep trying to break up with nuclear weapons, and nuclear weapons won't let me, but why whenever I get introduced as a nuclear scholar, I say, I'm not a nuclear scholar, and I'm going to explain to you how that works through the horizontal history idea. Now, I did my dissertation on the U.S. balance payments deficit during the Bretton Woods period. And when I went to look at it, most of the work had either been done by economists looking at international monetary relations work, or international political economists, people like Susan Strange. And they did a lot of analysis on why this particular monetary system generated the dollar and gold outflow that it did. When I went into the documents, what I found out was during the Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administration, whenever people discussed the balance of payments deficit, they said to themselves, well, the reason we have a balance of payments deficit is that we have so many foreign troops abroad that we pay in dollars, abroad with their spouses and their families. And the balance of payments deficit is actually roughly equivalent to these costs of foreign military expenditures abroad. You say, okay, from an economics perspective, there's questions with that, but that's certainly what they thought. These people, by the way, were obsessed and concerned that if they kept losing dollars and gold was threatened, that they might find a situation similar to what the US found itself in the late 20s and particularly the early 30s. You might have a run on the dollar, gold devaluation, a Great Depression. They didn't want to have that. They identified this as the key cost. And whenever you would see a balance of payments proposal produced, it would say, you want to deal with this problem, cut the amount of American troops in West Germany. And presidents like Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon would say, great, let's do that. And there would be further debate. People would say, well, what would happen if you reduced those troops from Western Europe? Well, they'd leave Western Germany. And there would be discussions about the political and military status of West Germany, which of course was divided, a generation removed from the horrors of Nazi Germany. There was great concern about the German question was the one issue that could cause World War III. If the US was to pull its troops out, would the West Germans be tempted to acquire their own atomic weapons? British and the French had done that. Eisenhower had sort of assumed it was inevitable at some point that West Germany would get nuclear weapons. Soviets made it quite clear that this would be the one thing that would cause World War III. In the end of the day, people said, reluctantly, we can't pull troops out of Western Europe. This then inspired a whole variety of policies around nuclear nonproliferation. The American policymakers said, we can't go to the West Germans and say, you can't have atomic weapons. We tried this in the interwar period. That ended really badly. So let's pursue a policy of global nonproliferation. If everyone in the world is signing this treaty, it makes it far easier to get the West Germans to sign it. And of course, if you want to make this credible, then you have to have certain nuclear strategies behind this. I've written about all of this, and I won't go into great detail, just to say, as I was looking at the documents, what I saw were things happening at the same time that policymakers were dealing with, but in academic disciplines were studied separately, right? You had economists studying the dollar and gold problem. You had historians of Germany studying the German question. You had non-proliferation specialists studying the question of non-proliferation. Then you had the nuclear strategy people looking at what the heck flexible response was. But from a policymaker's perspective, you could not understand any decision on any of those without connecting them, right? You cannot study nuclear nonproliferation and the nuclear nonproliferation treaty without understanding the dynamics of the German question, nor could you understand America's military commitment to West Germany and the tensions and challenges it caused without understanding the structure of the Bretton Woods monetary system. And so one of the things, this is horizontal history. We think of history as things taking place over time. And this second one is history over space. And this is one of the ones that, you know, in each of the 12 has a section like that. But when you do it this way, you realize a couple interesting things. One, that story that I just told you of those connections, a president or a leader, that's how they see it. This was another great thing of working with Phil on the Presidential Tapes Project. And it was insight that came to me because he knows you're President Kennedy, you have 9 meetings, one on Berlin, one on dealing with US steel and steel prices, the next one dealing with civil rights in the University of Mississippi, the next one dealing with the Test Ban Treaty, the next one dealing with the Congo. You have meeting after meeting after meeting. And you might have Ted Sorensen in all those meetings, you might not. You might have McGeorge Bundy in all of them, you might not. But the one person who was there was the president. And he understood how those issues connected. Yet the way we study them often in social science is to kind of ruthlessly cut them off from that horizontal side. And when you recognize that, you see some really interesting things. For example, I'm involved in a project now. It's a variety of people getting together to see if they can get the Gilpatrick Committee back again. This is something I wrote about 20 years ago. The Gilpatrick Committee was a group that President Johnson put together after China detonated a nuclear device in October of 1964, and which is the origins of America's robust and wildly successful nuclear nonproliferation policies, and leads directly to the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and a variety of thinking about security agreements and all the like. It's an extraordinary policy. And the discussion takes place in the fall of 64 and the winter of 65, and arguably produces the most successful American grand strategy in the post-war period. If you think about our nuclear nonproliferation policy, if you'd ask people in 1964, hey, we're going to have a policy that's going to contribute to a world that will make sure nuclear weapons are not used and the number of nuclear weapon states will be in the single digits in 2024, they'd say that's unfriggin' believable. That's an amazing success. What did those same exact people do at the same exact time? These were the same people who constructed America's policy for escalation, military escalation in Southeast Asia. Arguably the worst grand strategy of American foreign policy in the post-war period. And one of the interesting things about this, and this is the kind of the final thing I'll say, and it demonstrates why a historical sensibility generates some empathy for policymaking and the difficulties of decision-making, is this group of people didn't lose 20 IQ points when they went to the next meeting, going from, oh, we're on doing nuclear nonproliferation, now let's get drunk and talk about Vietnam. It demonstrates, and by the way, these are connected in certain interesting ways. It demonstrated that you can, if you do the horizontal history aspect, if you ask what's happening at the same time in a way that thinking historically allows you, it generates powerful insights that you might not have through other methodologies. Now, this is not to say it's a superior epistemology. It's just a different one that should be used and married with more robust, more muscular epistemologies from the social sciences and other disciplines. Anyway, that's the general overview. There's a whole bunch more that I could say about it, but I've already gone too long, and I really appreciate you listening to me draw on.
Historians, political scientists, concerned citizens, anthropologists, lawyers, former university presidents online, and it's going to be a very interesting discussion. I'd like to call on the CSAC fellows to raise their hands for the first section or two, and then I'll open it up. So I see X and then Lindsay. So if you can pass the microphone, and if you could take a minute to introduce yourself, not just your first and last name, but also, you know, what you're working on to give Frank a sense of who's asking the question.
Sure. My name is X Zhang. I'm a predoctoral fellow at CSAC. I'm currently working on my dissertation about revenge in international security. So my question is, do you see this process or skill of thinking historically more as a method of theory development or theory testing?
As a what?
As a method of theory development or theory testing?
Did I answer them?
Yeah.
Okay.
But go ahead.
Okay.
You're just doing that to let the microphone get.
Yeah. Method. I don't really. Yes, I would say it's a method.
Hi, I'm Lindsay. I am a postdoctoral fellow here working on nuclear policy.
There's about your background, your training. So.
Oh, I have a technical background, but I'm now doing more policy stuff. So also dealing with some of the interdisciplinary issues. I guess I was wondering first if you could expand a little bit more about malpractice, because you mentioned it at the beginning and then also at the end. And maybe the Cold War 2.0 analogy was one of your examples, but if you could just, I mean, I'd be interested to know what you think some of the common cases are. And then what I thought was interesting is maybe the Cold War 2.0, you were asserting that people use historical analogies incorrectly. And I think there might also be a reverse image issue, not reverse image, but a similar but different issue when people come up with terms to ignore history. Like I'm thinking of this whole emerging technology narrative in the nuclear space, which is very frustrating to me because a lot of the new technologies themselves are not actually new, and that we've been developing technology for a while. So where would that fall in your checklist? Because to me, that's a clear case where we really should be bringing history into some of these fields, but it's kind of like being pushed out by the narratives.
Trying to find, you write a book and you can't remember what you said. I want to see exactly I said about malpractice. The really good, the emerging technology question is really interesting to me because I forget which number it is, but what's this unprecedented historical myopia? I do think there are times when there are phenomena that may be new and where the use of going to the past can actually blind you. Now, I haven't done the analysis enough to say, and this is something I know Phil has worked a lot on, but when you think about something that Henry Kissinger was working on at the end of his life was thinking about how to effectively stabilize and make safe artificial intelligence, and especially AGI, and whether the parallels to his experience in the nuclear world made sense. I once asked him what was the most valuable intellectual activity he had ever participated in, and he thought for a very long time, and he said the Harvard MIT Arms Control Working Group that Tom Schelling had run, which is an extraordinary gathering that produces the intellectual architecture for modern American arms control, nuclear arms control. I think there is a very interesting set of questions to be asked about whether that history is directly relevant or not. One of the issues with historical myopia, so I spend a good deal of time in the book. Some people know that this is sort of a fascination of mine. This is this California dreaming idea, which is that out here in the 1970s, what it means to be a human being was completely reinvented and rechanged and transformed through a variety of interesting things, from technology to notions of gender, sex, even comedy, food, wine, everything, right? And a lot of what develops in terms of what I would call the modern human identity has some historical precedents, obviously, but some of it's quite novel and quite new. And when you're trying to ask yourself, the world we fit in today, how much of what we are seeing is new and how much of it we can find past parallels is a useful exercise. Scott very kindly mentioned these TNSR intros I do. I have one coming out tomorrow that brings together Charlie Brown Christmas, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, the Grinch, and Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump. And
Doesn't everybody do that?
yeah, so I will see if I pull it off. I have a whole theory about Christmas specials that I'm trying out tomorrow, and it gets actually to some of this historical myopia stuff. But there was a debate in the historical community about whether Trump and his political movement was fascism, right? And that's the kind of issue, and serious historians. There was a New York Times piece 2 weeks before the election. Robert Paxton, one of our greatest historians of fascism, said, I'm reluctant, I finally think it is. Tim Snyder has been very sort of pushing on this. And there's been other historians saying, no, I'm in the no camp. This is something new, this is different. But it gets to the larger point that I was making is that it is when we see a set of phenomena or set of circumstances, we don't recognize it is natural and actually important to go to the past and see if we see similarities in the past. But we have to be careful while doing that to recognize that what is different and what is similar. Now, there are other abuses of history. There's using, and this is really tricky in this environment. The historical judgment question, right? I call this the John Brown and the Harper's Ferry theory. And it was a day I went to Harper's Ferry bringing my kids, and they were fighting like crazy over an ice cream cone that had fallen. And I was reflecting upon Harper's Ferry being a hinge of history, right? You know, we all know really the Civil War begins at Harper's Ferry, and it's a beautiful place. And as I was trying to escape my fighting children, I came upon a church. It was an Irish Catholic church that had been bombed continually by both northern and southern sides. So put a British flag on the top of it to avoid being bombed. And I said, well, there's history right there. An Irish Catholic church running a British flag on a territory that had been flipped over 6 different times. And John Brown, as a character, has been seen as both anything from a terrorist to a savior, depending upon when you ask about. Same with Andrew Jackson. This point I make about Andrew Jackson tomorrow. Andrew Jackson's not held in very high regard these days, but I went back after the election and reread Arthur Schlesinger's Age of Jackson. It was written a month before D-Day. And FDR held up Jackson as the great savior of democracy. And part of this gets to a recognition that all reflections on the past involve normative judgments, even though we like to pretend they're not. And one of the things that I suggest is you can't escape it, but you should be aware of it. And I am not comfortable with history and excavating the past and using history as a courtroom. And too often history is used that way. And it can be used as a courtroom. It can be used to support bad ideas. It can be used to explain monocausal explanations of things. But then there's even less dangerous uses of history. I call it history as comfort food, right? Watching the History Channel, going to a historical site, right? You go to visit old Williamsburg, colonial Williamsburg. And if you're a historian, you recognize that by actually being there, you learn more about the United States in the 20s and 30s when it was developed than anything about colonial Virginia, right? It literally it's a very misleading, but what it can tell you a lot about is what Rockefeller was up to when he was funding it in the 20s and 30s. So I don't know, it's kind of a long-winded way of answering. There's a lot of things, because we all naturally go to the past, that it's easy to slip into certain errors.
Visiting scholar. Oh, thank you. Hi, I'm Alana Resnick. I'm a visiting scholar at CSAC and an anthropologist at UC Santa Barbara. I had two questions, sort of about your framing. So you said in the beginning, this question of, is the present thing we're looking at like or related to something of the past? And this is probably belying my anthropological leanings, but I'm wondering, I mean, in these phrasing, it's as though the present is self-evident, as though the present doesn't have to, is it, how do we even know the present? So I'm wondering if we're putting into question the fact that we, trying to undo the kind of idea that we know the past, we must also undo the idea that we know the present, that we can even see what's happening in front of us. Because in many ways, I think the relationship we were talking about goes both ways. So to look at the present and think we know the past can also lead us to look at the past and think we understand what we see in the present. So I'm wondering how you deal with these, if we think of both of those kinds of orbits as constantly and shifting in relationship to each other, how you would kind of think about that. And the second question,
I'm gonna ask you to just keep it there because we've
there
got
we go.
10 people who want to
Take it.
ask questions.
All right.
In only 20 minutes, so.
I'll keep this answer quick. It's great, and I completely agree with you. There's two things that I talk about in the book. There's the perspective question where I'm sure you've seen the great Kurosawa movie Rashomon, where the same crime is witnessed by four people who give four totally different answers. And this is the nature of the human experience. But what I say for, if you're a statesperson, right, being aware of that, and you're negotiating with Beijing, and you recognize that China has a profoundly different view, not just of the nature of world order, but of history and what history reveals and tells us. Doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but being aware of that difference is important. While at the same time, however, recognizing that you don't fall into something that I call historical vertigo, right? This book is explicitly for people making decisions. And if you're, let's say, the National Security Advisor of the United States or the President of the United States, you were elected to represent the American people on a certain platform at a certain time to advocate certain interests, right? You weren't elected to sort of care about the concerns about people in other places or at other times. So there's a balancing act. History recognizes exactly what you're talking about, that varying spatial and temporal perspectives can alter and shake in a Heisenbergian kind of way our notion of reality. But at the end of the day, to make decisions, we can't like let it go through historical vertigo, because to not make decisions is to make a decision. This is one of the problems. I talk about this sort of paralysis that can come from this kind of, at the end of the day, this is not dissimilar from an anthropological framing, but it's still what I am offering is guidance for people who have to make choices and decisions. And to not make a choice or decision will have repercussions. And the choices and decisions they are making is usually based on a constituency and a certain mandate and a certain set of interests. So that's how I would answer that.
Hi, I'm Alan Weiner. I look forward to buying the book when it's on the street. Actually, Lindsay kind of asked my question about examples of malpractice. And so I had a choice, either wave off or then come up with a new question. So I went with option 2. So I'm a lawyer, and we, sort of look at individual cases in terms of our methodology, and we kind of extract, maybe generalizable principles in this inductive manner from it, but small numbers of cases typically. So I'm interested in cases, and you mentioned to Lindsay some examples of, bad uses of history. Have you got some examples of really great uses of history where policymakers, in the moment, did a great job drawing lessons from historical examples, and it contributed to better decision making?
Ben Bernanke in 2007, 2008, 2009 as Federal Reserve Chairman. He had done his dissertation. He was an economic historian. He understood, since his dissertation was about banking failures, and he'd done scholarship on banking failures in the 1930s and the Great Depression, he recognized that one of the causes, that there were several causes that took a sharp financial crisis and downturn and turned it into a depression. One was cutting off liquidity. Remember in 2008, 2009, he was very quick to sort of flood the market with liquidity. The second was not seeking international cooperation. And if you were to swap out the counterfactual of a Federal Reserve chairman who had not had that economic history and that sensitivity, particularly to financial and monetary disasters, I think that you could have had an outcome after 2008 that was far worse. And it was his historical, not just, he possessed the historical sensibility, but he also had this historical thinking skills. And, you know, it's one reason why the Great Recession didn't become a Great Depression, which, if you look at the numbers in December 2008 were as bad, if not worse, than anything that had been seen in the 32-33 period. And it's also why the US may have done better than other developed economies.
I'm Henry Etzkowitz. As it happens, I have the same bachelor's degree as you from the University of Chicago in history on the social science side, which also allowed you to set a special field. And the one I made up was history of higher education.
Oh, great.
But what I think you've done in a very mild-mannered way is handed down a searing indictment of the university and its silos. Even in our interdisciplinary fields, they're really a way of handling unrecognized specialties, even the Committee on Social Thought. That was its real function. So my mentor, Edwin McClellan, got his PhD in Japanese studies before there was a department that could handle that. So you're really saying, where is H.G. Wells now that we need him? Or Arnold Toynbee?
Yeah.
We don't have these people anymore, or do we?
Or do we? That's the question.
It's a great question. And I should confess, I was actually not a history major at University of Chicago. I was a political science major, and I was a research assistant for 2 years at John Mearsheimer. And the reason I decided to study become a professor was because of John. And the reason I decided to become a historian is I graduated in 1988. 1989 happened, and literally nothing I learned explained any of it. So I'm kind of a recalcitrant political scientist from back in the day. The whole question of how universities organize knowledge is far bigger than a question. It's an important question, and I do think we're in a challenge. A place like CSAC does such amazing work of bringing together people from different disciplines to engage and interact with each other, scientists, engineers, historians, anthropologists. It's really an ideal model, and I wish more universities did this. I tried not in the book. I've written in other places about why I think the disciplinary structure in the social sciences and humanities is failing. I will just say that my favorite activity, Scott will get a kick out of this, when I was at MIT, was, for reasons that are still unclear to me, I was asked by the nuclear engineering department to co-chair a senior search in nuclear security and engineering. And I, of course, even though I know nothing about nuclear engineering, I said, sure, of course they should ask me, right? That's just the ego of a male professor. But I hung out with nuclear engineers all year. And one of the things I realized about engineering disciplines is they're not disciplines, they're problem-oriented. So you hang out with nuclear engineers and you have material science people, you have physicists, you have computational people, you have organic chemistry people. They don't care about the disciplinary background. They care about your ability to answer and solve a particular question. And this is why, you know, I forget if it was, maybe it was the biology department had 26 different departments, and they constantly create new constellations of knowledge around what the set of problems were. And there's probably flaws in that model, but you see in the science and engineering worlds that are problem focused, and I'm sure it's similar here at Stanford, there's an ability to reorganize and redeploy intellectual talent around problems. Yet we in the social sciences have the same disciplines the Germans gave us and handed down to Johns Hopkins University in the 1870s with very sort of little change. In terms of whether we have these people or not, my favorite MIT moment was I was walking with a guy, Dick Lanza, a physicist. He was co-chairing the search. And his phone rings and he looks down at his phone and it says Buzz Aldrin. And he says, ugh, he hits no one. I'm like, what are you doing that? Buzz Aldrin's calling. He's like, oh, Buzz wants to go on the nuclear mission to Mars. And I keep telling him he's too old. I'm like, what nuclear mission to Mars? It's like, oh, my daughter and I were developing a plan to sort of, she's at Los Alamos, I'm here to have a nuclear mission to Mars. And, you know, I may not live to see it, but Buzz won't. So Buzz can't go, but Buzz keeps harassing me to go. And to me, that was highlighted the sort of magic of what you were talking about, that ability when universities in certain areas, not in our areas, but in certain areas can reorganize and redeploy knowledge to think about, okay, the nuclear mission to Mars, that's a pretty big problem. Let's bring the best talent around to see if we can come up with an answer.
Hey, sir, love the talk. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Michael Matt. I'm a National Defense Fellow representing the Air Force, and I'm a B-52 aviator by trade, so nukes and checklists are near and dear to my heart.
Nice.
So, which drives my question. I like the 12 questions that you have written out there, and I'm wondering, in an ideal world where your book is read and received well, how does that apply and at what levels in order to shape kind of policy going forward? And then also in all checklists, there's always cautions and warnings, which are known, you know, boldface items. Do you have any cautions and warnings that you would advise when keeping this checklist in mind?
So it's a great question. And as I highlighted, and I'm going to some more length in the book, it's not a perfect parallel because I'm sure when you're doing it on the B-52, there's very yes and no, and there's measurements and things like that. Many of the questions that I ask don't lend themselves to binary answers or to measurements, but it's more to focus on asking a set of questions that you might not ask otherwise as you're making a decision about a complex set of issues facing radical uncertainty about the future, not knowing what's going to happen, right? I mean, you know, the great test of this would be, I can imagine sitting around trying to make Syria policy right now, which has got to be so unbelievably difficult and so hard. And you can think about where they're trending. It's clearly a punctuated equilibrium moment, right? Many of our social science models sort of assume a kind of a linear progression. History is a little more sensitive to the idea it can be like this and then like that. And these 12 were just put forward as suggestions to get the conversation going. There's really a couple audiences for this book. One is my effort to find ways for all of the policymakers who come to me and says, I love history. How can I use it to help make difficult choices? Part of it's also for the history profession to say, you've got this extraordinary power and capability that's in demand. Just be more explicit about what its benefits are. So I can imagine there would be all sorts of cautions. Somebody else would come up with a completely different list. I'm sure that the checklists for you are different depending on what plane you're flying and what the mission is. But it's just asking historians to say, when you sit down and explain what it is you're doing, how would you answer these questions?
Let me ask the last question from someone online. Once you do, tell her who are the historians who have been policymakers who you think have kept the best historical sensibilities as they are making decisions?
Great question. So just before I answer that, one of the things I do deal with in the book is to say, how is it you impart this thinking historically to busy national security or decision makers or whoever, understanding that they can't get PhDs in history, right? And we deal with this all the time. All of us want to understand complex subjects and have to rely on experts. And so part of this is a way also for people who aren't historians to kind of navigate and answer sort of the question. But he's a great, great person. When I first started Kissinger Center, I was looking for an associate director. And I had a conversation with a good friend of all of ours, a guy I've been friends with for 25 years, Colin Call. And he said, I've got the perfect person for you, this guy, Alex Bick. And Alex had been running the Syria desk at the NSC at the end of the Obama administration. He'd been policy planning and he was looking for a job. But he also happened to be an early modern Dutch historian, working with Tony Grafton at Princeton. So me, I do American foreign policy. Real historians look at me. This is kind of like fake, phony stuff. Like Alex has written a brilliant book that should be coming out with Oxford University Press sometime soon. Being a historian, he's unbelievably careful. And it's based on one day of debates and discussions among the Dutch West Indies Corporation about what to do about their dispositions in Brazil in 33, and how that shapes European politics, Latin America for centuries to come. And it's an extraordinary piece of work. He had to learn like a form of Old Dutch that is almost out of existence. Real historian. So he's my associate director at the Kissinger Center, great guy, we have a wonderful time. He goes in the Biden administration, helps draft the national security strategy with Rebecca Listner and Tom Wright. And then after the Afghanistan situation, Jake Sullivan asked him to do what was called the Tiger Team exercise to prepare for all the sort of set of circumstances that could happen if Russia invaded Ukraine. And he did this, and he did scenario exercises and a variety of other things. And Phil knows him well because he's done these for our graduate students in the IPSCON program. And he's fascinating because he knows as much policy and is incredibly sensitive, sophisticated policy maker. In fact, after he was at the NSC, he went to the State Department, and he was kind of the sort of interlocutor between the State Department and the NSC on a variety of important issues. Beloved, but 98% of the people who know him in DC have no idea that he is also one of our premier early modern Dutch imperial historians. And it's clear to me that his effectiveness as an incredibly thoughtful and effective decision maker is not unrelated to his extraordinary historical work. He's very quiet, he's very unassuming, he's a kind of a lovely human being, so he's not the type of person to put himself forward. But in a lot of ways, he's sort of kind of the ideal type of this sort of person. He's someone you should have come out here. He's now at the University of Virginia doing stuff for the Batten School, and a really thoughtful guy.
Please join me in thanking Frank Gavin.